my fourth panel. My wife's actually in another one right now. Yeah.
You guys are loaded.
No, I'd love to make it work though. Actually, you decided you wanted to live out here. My wife is speaking here today, and my wife is already saying we're moving to Boulder. So. Write down your phone number again, or your cell phone, or whatever. Okay. Is your cell on here? Okay. Thanks, Tom. So are you suggesting that if I say, well, whatever Jim said is probably not inadequate?
That would be very inadequate. Very inadequate.
How are you, Joe? I'm sorry, man. I had to fight my way in. Everybody wants it.
Okay, just go on the website and look at it. I bet you're going to say HR.
Great.
And then send them a note. I do that, but I grew up in this family. And tell them your experience as a kid. And just up front, I would like to give something back. You're not really asking for a job. It may be that. I guarantee you, they stand some life coaching. I've been there.
You don't have an extra pen, do you? Yes. Okay, I promise I won't steal it. No, you can have it. I will take it. All right. Wow. Wow. Please step away from the door.
What?
Apparently.
Well,
Apparently.
yeah, so there's two ways to deal with it. You either tell something to them, or you tell us to them. I mean, either one.
Hi there. How are you?
another one.
You don't have an extra piece of paper on my chest.
Here.
Anything.
Here, I got it.
Oh, great. Perfect. Jim will set up. How are you? It's great.
How are you? Good to see you again.
Nobody does.
Good afternoon. All right.
So wait a few minutes.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. There's quite a crowd out there, so you should all feel really, really happy to be in here, seated for this wonderful panel. We are still letting a few students in. And are there any seats, like I see a few over there? There's 2 or 3 seats right down in the middle here. If you'd raise your hand where there's an empty seat next to you, that would be great. There's a seat over here, seat right here in front. Thank you very much.
This is going to be, the Q&A is just going to be exciting. I have no doubt about it. Yeah.
So there's one seat out here. The gentleman has his hand in, and there's one seat up, several seats out here. If anyone likes to come to the front here. There are two seats over here on the left-hand side. Thank you. All right. So thank you for holding up your hands. There's one right here in the middle. And I think with that, I will get us underway. My name is Bob Morehouse. I'm delighted to be the moderator for this session, which is 2613, U.S. Foreign Policy Toward Boko Haram, ISIS, and ... which I think will be interesting to see how our panelists relate to the ... I do ask that you turn off your cell phones if you haven't already done that. I appreciate that very much. And I welcome you to this great session. I think a lot of us have a little bit of knowledge, a great deal of confusion, a certain amount of fear, and a lot of curiosity about this same topic today. So without any further ado, I'd love to introduce very briefly. I think you can see our august panel is just terrifically well qualified to talk about this today. To my immediate left is Jim Smith. He was a U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and then he joined the Cohen Group, and he had a distinguished military career, retiring from the U.S. Air Force as a brigadier general. What really interested me is he has 4,000 air hours with the F-15 and a T-38 combat sorties during the Desert Storm. So I welcome to the panel Jim Smith. And next up is Joanne Grady-Husky. Joanne is an international educator and co-founder and vice president of I Live to Lead, which is a young women's international leadership program. She is also a co-founder of Global Adjustments. She's helped business people in China, India, Kenya, and Taiwan transition to international living. Joanne, welcome to our panel. Thank you very much for being here. Next is Mickey Edwards, who served in Congress for 16 years. And he was also on Harvard's Kennedy School of Government faculty, and then Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and he currently serves at the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C. And finally, to my left at the end of the table there is Joe Cirincione. I think I may have
That was good.
mispronounced that. He told me it's like minestrone, so I tried to remember that. So. He's president of Plowshares Fund, which is a global security foundation. He was also vice president for national security and international policy at the Center of American Progress, and also as a director for nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So welcome very much, Joe. And with that, I think you all know sort of our typical rules. We're going to give each of the panelists an opening statement of 8 to 10 minutes. We'll have a little back and forth among them, but I'm trying to save as much time as possible to ask you to ask questions and elicit a conversation here in the room about this great topic. So without further ado, I would love to ask Jim to lead us off.
Phew.
Thank you.
And we all know that this is going to be a panel that's going to be energized by the questions, but let me take a few minutes to set the stage for some of that. I think the first issue is we ought to decide what we're going to call it. In the case of ISIS, ISIS is the Egyptian goddess of fertility. Probably not the right name for an extremist group. Now, some people use the term ISIL, which is Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. It certainly had its origins in Iraq, as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and moved west from there. But it's much more global in its recruiting. So ISIL is not an effective term for it anymore. The U.S. government defaulted to the Islamic State. None of our partners in the region like that term because they wholeheartedly disagree with the notion of the state. They actually disagree with it being called Islamic. So other than that, Islamic State would be good. Now, there are some people in our government who've then moved to call it Islamic State Group because it's not really a state, but they want to call themselves that. Call them the Islamic State dudes, I guess. I don't know. It doesn't fit. What people in the region call it is Daesh. And it's a pejorative term, but in the Arab world, who is not aligned with this kind of thinking, Daesh is the term that is most often used. And then you've got to figure out what they are, because the title of the panel, U.S. Foreign Policy Toward Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Nusra, these all get lumped together under the term terrorist groups. And in fact, our president, several weeks ago, in his statement, lumped them all together, say these are terrorists and they're not Islamic. Well, I would differ because each of these is different, and there is a fundamental difference between Daesh and the rest of these groups, which are essentially insurgent groups. And part of the characteristics of an insurgency is you have no hierarchy, you operate in cells, no attempt to control land because that's a burden, and the most challenging part of an insurgency is the transition from insurgency to conventional warfare where you gain and hold land. So if you look at Al-Qaeda, if you look at Al-Nusra in Iraq, if you look at Al-Shabaab, these are essentially terrorist groups operating as an insurgency with in a cell-like structure with no hierarchy that anybody in each cell knows about, and they're out to create violence to overthrow a government. Daesh is much different. I mean, Daesh has declared itself a caliphate, and therefore has declared itself a state. One of the reasons our initial attacks against Daesh was targeting oil centers was to cut the money flow into Daesh because they were using that money to run governments. They set up a formal structure in each of the towns they held, and then a published hierarchy. They essentially declared themselves a government, operating as a government, and then using criminal activity to fund that government. That's a completely different animal than these other, quote, terrorist groups. And to lump it all together is a mistake because you would take a much different strategy against somebody who is trying to gain and hold land than you would against an insurgent group. I would also argue that you can't say they're not Muslim. Now, I think the president said that because he did not want to offend the American Muslim community, but that's fine. And certainly these guys do not share the values that Muslims and most of the rest of the world share. But to say they're not Muslim is wrong because their intellectual foundation is based on a rigorous examination of the Quran, in some cases by learned scholars, that's focused on this idea of the end of days is coming and we need to purge the earth and prepare for those ends of days. The center of gravity, if you will, is the holding of land, the caliphate. So when you look at a strategy against Daesh, it's focused on that. Much different strategy than you would Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, or Al-Shabaab. When you look at a strategy or a policy to overcome this, I would refer you to King Abdullah of Jordan, who did a weekend show just a couple of weeks ago, and he was very clear and specific. It's a three-phased operation. One, you've got to do kinetic operations to roll back Daesh. Secondly, you've got to focus on security within the borders of the existing nation states. That's a problem in Kenya right now. And third, you've got to have a conversation inside of Islam to redefine what are the Islamic values that we hold dear. In other words, it is Islam until somebody undermines the legitimacy of the argument. That has to happen in that part of the world, which takes you to the third phase of undermining support for extremism. Number one, the intellectual argument inside of their religion. Certainly all Muslims are not extremists, but they're not attracting a lot of Southern Baptists to the cause, okay? So this is a debate that has to happen inside that religion, and it's got to start there. And you see statements by King Abdullah of Jordan, President Sisi of Egypt, who are standing up finally and making that statement. And then you've got to look at the causes of support for extremism, and they extend to governance, to the distribution of wealth, to the recruiting. How do you cut the flow of recruits to these causes, and how do you expedite the return of those who would really like to go home? And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I think the reason I'm on this panel is that in 1998, I was in the embassy of Nairobi with my little children, and my husband was in the building, and the building was blown up. And that was the outing, so to speak, the coming out of Al-Qaeda. And since then, the proliferation of different groups, as Jim just said, with many, many names, has been very complicated. I want to take 1 second here to just say how sad I am to see Kenya back on the map again this week. And I feel so sorry for all the families of those students who were murdered this week. 150 innocent kids in college by Al-Shabaab. But we're here to talk about all of these many groups. And I wanted to just take a look at some of the things that have been going on in foreign policy. I'm a member of a foreign service family. I live overseas. And we represent the United States trying to defend some of the things that we're doing in response to all of this. Now, I agree with Jim. I think ISIS is a totally different kettle of fish than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda wanted to get the West out of the Middle East. It really would like to attack the West. It was trying to kill me, an American. It was trying to blow up American embassies. The intention of Al-Qaeda was to defeat the West. ISIS is very different. ISIS, originally, Obama said was a junior league. We now know this is really not true. It's much more dangerous than anybody probably understood at the beginning. They are taking land, as Jim said. They're interested in the battle, the endless battle between Arabs and Persians, between Sunnis and Shiites. They want to take us back to the 7th century caliphate. They want to defeat Rome, AKA all of us. They want to be the leader of the world. Perhaps because of our government's confusion over all of this, and Iraq's President Maliki's poor leadership, we allowed for a little space for ISIS to flourish. This is the thinking in the United States right now. There was a lot of confusion over where we should go in terms of defending. Now, again, defending Iraq, the president just recently this month has decided that we have to continue to keep troops working in Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a battle going on right now between the Iraqi troops that we're supporting and the United States troops about whether they should attack Mosul or not, and how they're going to take Iraq back from the ISIS land grab. As you all know, President Obama has had a very restrained foreign policy towards Syria. Many in our Congress have called him passive regarding this. For a while, there wasn't a clear opposition, and it wasn't clear who we should support in Syria. Now that 200,000 more people have been killed, our government is now getting involved in training some of the rebels in Syria. Interestingly, we're confused about who our enemy is here now. Assad was our enemy, but ISIS is fighting Assad. So as everyone's saying now, the enemy of our enemy is our enemy. In Yemen, we were supporting President Hadi, who was a Sunni leader. Now, all of a sudden, Hadi's out, and the Shiites, the Houthis, are trying to come in. And this battle, as I said, between the Sunnis and Shiites is playing out all throughout the region. So it's very complicated. I think it's complicated for everyone in the United States. The media doesn't help. They blow it up and make it very, very scary. I believe ISIS is a professional media organization. It is orchestrated to get us scared. They dress in their orange clothes with their black hoods. It's all for us it's to create fear. And it's working. Look at all of you in this room. People are worried. Graham Wood recently wrote in The Atlantic that this idea that they want to establish a Muslim caliphate is what they're after. Is that really what we're afraid of? Can we in the 21st century not defeat a 7th century lifestyle? So, what is foreign policy? President Obama, I believe, and I'm going to put out here, I believe that he has a very sophisticated and somewhat nuanced vision for what the world should look like. One of the criticisms in Congress is that he said something like, we shouldn't do stupid shit, right? I think what he meant was we shouldn't invade and blow up countries like we did Iraq. That was a stupid thing to do. And look at the results. A lot of what's happening is a result of us invading in Iraq. What he's trying to do is take it in a very, very much different way. He's talking about forming coalitions. As Jim was saying, let the Muslim world join in combating this terrorism. Let them speak out about the atrocities. Let them fight alongside of us in ways, perhaps boycotting, financial constraints on the area, collaborations, partnerships. I believe what he's done with Iran is a very, very good thing. That we've now come to a point where we might be able to beat back some of the development of the atomic, the nuclear bombs in Iran. That can save not only the region, the whole world, for a long time, at least 10 years. It is, the president's position is that we need to look at this in a very nuanced way with an international tradecraft of diplomacy. A totally different way than a lot of the members of our Congress are speaking. Sorry, Mickey. I know
I'm not there.
You were once. Who are still talking about this as if we're fighting a 20th century kind of world problem. They're talking about it with one state mentality when we're really dealing with a non-state entity. So Congress right now is in the middle of authorization of the use of military force bill, which many of you may know about. After 9/11, Bush asked for a pretty blanket statement that he could use military force to fight terrorism anywhere or any threat to the United States anywhere in the world. That's being discussed again in Congress now. And we have to look at it now without regard to geographical boundaries, because it's not about that any longer. ISIS is moving all over the place. So I don't believe our president is passive. I believe that he's actually very 21st century. It is complicated. He's doing the necessary to figure out who is who, what is what, and how we're going to respond. But the most important thing, and Susan Rice mentioned this recently when they were bringing up the national strategy, that they have to look at the world, their vision of the world in a larger way, in a macro way. If we stay completely focused on fighting ISIS, we're missing the point. We have to look at the large picture. We have to look at Russia and China and climate change. And more than that, we need to look at our values. My biggest takeaway from the bombing in Nairobi, and I'll leave you with this, it doesn't work to bomb people. They don't climb out of bombed buildings. I didn't climb out of there and say, oh, I really like these people. And no one is going to, civilians in all of these countries who are going to be bombed by us if we take a military option, are not going to say thank you, United States. We need to collaborate, and I agree with you totally that the collaboration has to come with the countries in the Middle East, and I believe that our president is actually thinking that way, so thank you.
This is hard, Joe, because I can't think of anything that either of them said that I disagree with. So, you know, let me start with a couple of general observations. You know, we have in this country for many years struggled with what should be the root, the basis of our foreign policy and how we approach other countries. This is not just how we deal with Middle East on the fly, one enemy at a time. It's what are our basic underlying principles about how we interact with the world and what determines whether or not we use military force or not use military force. So we've always had this battle between people who thought that we should be actively engaged in promoting and defending and preserving human rights, and which I am totally in favor of. I'm very much a human rights activist, but you don't do it with the point of a gun. You do it through foreign aid. You do it through all the other means of our soft power. You don't try to force people to be democracies. We have made that mistake all too long. Or we say, you know, what we are is we support democracy. You know, we're going to go to war or whatever to support a democracy. Well, actually, that's not what we're about. If I can, you know, I think Fareed Zakaria has had it right. You know, America's not based on democracy. It's based on liberal democracy. It's based on, you know, democracies that support the rights of women, that support legal process, that, you know, all the pieces that we have. So we get a little too quick to get ourselves involved with propping up people, you know, that we ought not to be propping up. So when we start talking about what are the basic underlying principles, one is to remember that you reap what you sow. You know, what you're saying about the bombing. You know, we look at some of the problems we've had around the world after we supported the Shah of Iran and Batista and Somoza, and then we said, wow, how come the people who came to power in those countries don't like us? It's because we supported their oppressors. We didn't like the fact that they were denied the basic human rights and the right to vote, civil liberties, you know, and we were propping them up. And so we need to be very careful and judicious when we decide, you know, whose aid we are going to come to. Don't be impetuous. Obviously, Jim didn't speak about this, but, you know, going to war in Iraq, I actually supported the first Gulf War. I thought after Iraq had invaded a neighboring country, you know, I thought it was proper to respond because of treaties, but I thought in terms of the second Gulf War, that was ridiculous. You know, going to war, sending American troops to die, you know, for somebody because he, you know, supposedly had weapons he didn't have. I mean, we're paying a big price, you know, for that flexing our muscles. But it's not just there. I mean, I like the fact that the current president is being more temperate, more judicious. But he hasn't always been that way. One of the important lessons in leadership to be a great communicator is two things. One is to know when you need to speak and how to speak, what to say, and when is to not talk. One time, the president did not do us any favors. Was with the red line in Syria. We're going to draw a red line, and by failing to do that, and he shouldn't have said it in the first place. And then when he did, and did nothing about it, it weakened the ability of other countries to take us at his word. But that's not the only one. Mubarak was a bad guy. Mubarak needed to go, and the Tahrir Square rallies, forced him out, and Mubarak said, "I'm out. I'm going. I'm not running again. My son's not going to run. We'll finish this term. We're out." The president said, "No, that's not good enough. You need to go right now." Reignited the thing, and we got Morsi, who came in and started shutting down civil liberties, shutting down the press, as he brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power, because we just couldn't keep our mouths shut. Then we did the same thing in Libya, where we immediately, Gaddafi was awful and evil and needed to go, but we jumped in before we knew who the other guys were. Before we knew who they were and what they were supporting and what they were after. And there's something to be said. And he's doing it now. I like what he's doing now, but a little more calm, deliberate. Think this all through before you start talking about what you're going to do. I think we need to always keep the threats that we face in perspective. And I know I'm saying controversial things. I think that all of these various forces Jim referred to are bad, and they need to be stopped. And they can do harm to us. They can blow up buildings to us. But in the war against this terrorism, we used to lose more people during World War II between 8 a.m. and noon almost every day. I mean, this is not a fundamental threat to the security and well-being of the American people. So what's going to happen if some of these groups take over another territory? If they take over Saudi Arabia, it's going to be the king who's going to get beheaded, not us. So it ought to be Saudi Arabia's fight. It ought to be Jordan's fight. They're the countries that are under the gun, and we don't need to send American troops over until they themselves have really jumped in. And if they say, we can't do it by ourselves, but we're sending our people there to fight, we're putting our money into this fight, we're carrying the burden here, and if you can give us additional help, that would be great. And we have no business being in there saying, okay, we will take this battle on, while you sit there distributing your oil money among your royal family. So I just think it's time that we backed off a little bit and said, slow down.
Congressman Edwards, you haven't lost a beat. Drop the mic, man. Walk off the stage. That was... I have nothing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. And for those students in the audience, I'm going to start off with some very specific, logical observations, and then I'm going to hope to convince you I know what I'm talking about and end with sweeping generalities that you might... We've never seen a group like... I'm sorry, I call them ISIS. We've never seen a group like ISIS, although I do, in fact, prefer Daesh. This is an apocalyptic, messianic terrorist organization that controls a huge swath of territory, larger than some of our states, that is rich. Estimates start at 1 billion and go up. That is highly skilled in social media, unlike anything we've seen before, and that has a global jihadist recruitment mechanism. Now, what this means for me, since I specialize in nuclear weapons policy, is that this is a unique terrorist WMD threat. We've always been talking about this. We haven't seen terrorists use weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, because it's very hard to do. It's very hard to get them. But if this group could get their hands on chemical weapons, and it's a real good thing that one of the consequences of President Obama's statement about chemical weapons in Syria was that Syria agreed to give up all its chemical weapons, we'd be facing a much more difficult threat if there were still 1,300 tons of nerve gas and mustard gas in Syria. But if they could get their hands on chemical weapons or a nuclear weapon from a stockpile in the former Soviet Union or Pakistan, they would have the money and the base in which to build that material into a bomb, and they would have the global network that could deliver that weapon back into a country from that one of its recruits came from. So it is a national security threat to the United States. But I agree with the other previous speakers, we have to keep this in perspective. And here's the three observations I would make about ISIS. It is not the Mongol horde. We are not going to be seeing ISIS knocking on the gates of Vienna anytime soon. This is an Iraqi-Syria regional threat. It is formidable. These are hard, tough, skilled fighters, but it is limited. It is defeatable. One of the sources of its strength is the Sunni tribal leaders. That's their base. That's where they're getting this from. They've made alliances with the warlords and Sunni tribal leaders in the cities and states that they've now, cities and towns that they've overrun. And that tells you something about how to defeat them. You got to drain the ocean. You got to defeat. You got to withdraw that Sunni support. This is what happened. This is what. Remember the surge in Iraq? Well, the reason the surge really succeeded was because of what they call the Sunni awakening. The Sunni tribal leaders shifted allegiance from the rebels that were fighting us in the same cities that were fighting ISIS now, Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah, is they shifted sides and they blocked with the government. So you've got to get these Sunni tribal leaders to shift again. But here's your problem. The reason the Sunnis allied with ISIS is because of the policies of the Iraqi government that we put in place. Prime Minister al-Maliki. He's a Shia. Now, the Shias are the majority of the population in Iraq, about 65%. Long oppressed by the Sunnis. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. And this was the British way of rule. This is the way the British were able to control vast colonies far in excess of their actual military might. They divided the people, they elevated a minority and empowered them to rule over the majority of the country. They did it in place after place. So when Saddam fell, when we kicked him out, the Shias came to power, well, the idea was that the Shia-led government was going to be inclusive. Well, al-Maliki was not inclusive. He excluded the Sunnis from the army decisions, from these foreign policy decisions, from the revenues. And so they got increasingly bittered, and now they're basically in rebellion against the Shia-led government in Baghdad. Here's the final point. We lit the fire. Congressman has already mentioned this. We're the reason that there's chaos in Iraq. And you have to remember this so that you know what to do now. I'm not raising this to bash Bush. I'm raising this because we have incredibly short-term historical memories. I mean, for God's sakes, it was only 12 years ago. And this mess that we're in now, this was predictable. In fact, it was predicted. Back in June, I wrote an article called "Don't Be Sucked into War with Iraq Again." Published on Defense One. You can look it up. And I quote Tom Ricks, who wrote what I think is one of the best books on the Iraq War, Fiasco. And he speaks in terms that the invasion of Iraq will likely go down as the worst military security decision in the history of America. and the consequences won't be known for decades. And he concludes his book by saying, look, there's a small chance, he was writing in, I think, 2005, there's a small chance that this could work out, that we could build a stable democracy and you could set off a democratic tsunami, as the analysts at the American Enterprise Institute were predicting. That could happen, but more likely, we're going to see a civil war in Iraq that will rage for decades. It could go into a regional war. Iraq could break up. And under any of those scenarios, Iraq is going to become a haven for terrorists. I wrote similar things when I was at the Carnegie Endowment. So we knew that this was a distinct possibility, in fact, even a probability. Okay, so here we are. So what that tells you is you have to understand the limits of what we're able to do at this point. There are no good choices here. There is no magic solution. And I wrote my article because the Washington Post, a paper that cheerleaded us into the war in Iraq, was now cheerleading us again into sending more troops. That the solution was to stop the withdrawal of troops from Iraq and Afghanistan and to put new ones in. And the president is under tremendous pressure every week to increase the U.S. military force in Iraq. So he's faced with a difficult choice, and I think we have a more military presence than I'm comfortable with still in Iraq, but I understand, and I'd be hesitant to draw it down at this point. So it's trainers, it's support troops. You know, numbers, I don't know the exact number, but it's something like 20,000 troops are probably at this point in Iraq. It's not that many. And we are helping to retrain the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army we spent billions training. The Iraqi army that completely collapsed at the first assault of ISIS. 30,000 troops deserted in one day in an ISIS assault from 1,000 ISIS fighters. Their leaders fled first. So we can rebuild it. We're in a tricky cooperation with the Shia militia, the people who used to kill us in Iraq. We're in a tricky cooperation with Iran, who's got boots on the ground. The Revolutionary Guard is in Iraq fighting ISIS. We just ran close air support bombing runs into Tikrit to help them take the city of Tikrit, which they did last week, take it back from ISIS. It's all tricky business. It makes me uncomfortable, but I think that's probably the right medium course to go. But put more troops in, think that there's some solution here, think that we should be staying in Iraq indefinitely, that we should be staying in Afghanistan indefinitely. I'm sorry. I basically think that what we're witnessing is the breakup of the colonial boundaries drawn after World War I that artificially drew lines across tribal and ethnic areas. Did you ever wonder why those lines were so straight, why every place looks like Colorado in the Middle East? They were drawn in Paris and London. They didn't represent the will of the people, the realities on the ground. They intentionally cut Kurdistan, or the area inhabited by Kurds, into 3 different states. They wanted to divide the Kurds. This is how they decided they could rule this vast area. Well, the British and French are long gone, and we're not. I really do think that a good part of the last 20, 30, 40 years has been us cleaning up the colonial mess created by Britain and France. Colin Powell talked about the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you own it. He actually got it wrong. The actual rule is you break it, you pay for it. Well, we broke Iraq, and we have paid a fortune in lives, in treasure, in international legitimacy. We have paid enough. It's stopped paying anymore.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate this, laying the groundwork. I'd love for you to speak to each other a little bit, maybe focus a bit more on what can we do, because it does seem as I believe it was Jim who said there are no good choices, but could we concentrate a little bit on what, if you were Secretary of State today, what would you be recommending to the President? Who would like to take that?
Oh, I'm happy to start. But before you offer any recommendation, you have to ask yourself the question, what next? So if you do something, what is the likely course of action following or the unintended consequence of that action? And that's a bit of the challenge that we have today. If you look back at the surge that Joe so effectively described, we won the battle, we lost the war. If you look in Somalia, Al-Shabaab has been rolled back 75% of the territory that they held. So why are they still a threat? Because the warlords have moved in to fill the vacuum where Al-Shabaab was before, and the situation is every bit as bad. So the first requirement on any action is to ask, what is the governance model that's going to be in place if you do or don't do something? And if there's not a governance model that is going to win the war, win the peace, then reconsider the action. On the case of Iraq, I don't see it as binary. Either we should be in there full force or we should leave and go home. I believe it's based on a consideration, again, of the governance model. I absolutely agree with Joe in his thought process about the Maliki government. But what happened to the Sunni tribal chiefs in El Anbar? We left, there was nobody to look after them. You had a central government that was singularly focused on its relationship with Iran, made no attempt to build a coalition with the other Arab Gulf states, and it was a Sunni-dominated government. So Daesh comes in early on, and you see an alignment with Daesh because there's nobody else to protect their interests. And they ask now, as you know, Saudi Arabia is a part of the coalition supporting the new government in Baghdad. If you were a tribal chief and you're asking yourself, who's going to be there to protect us after Daesh leaves, then you've got, the answer has to be the central government. Okay? So if you look in Iraq, you've got support by the other Sunni nations, Sunni majority nations, for this effort because the new government in Iraq has committed itself to minority representation and the notion that they're a government of all of the people of Iraq, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd. Yet to be proven, but if in fact they will do that, then it's all hands on deck to rid them of this disease. What is the United States' involvement? It should be one, push this idea of inclusive governance. Because if you don't have that, no amount of military force is going to matter. And then secondly, don't do what you can do what you should do. The reason the Iraqi army bolted after we spent 10 years training them, they had a 3-year commitment when they signed up. How long had we been gone from Iraq? 3 years. The people we trained were gone. And Maliki had put political guys, Shia, with no military experience in generals' positions as division commanders because of a political move. It wasn't a professional army anymore. So do we have a role to rebuild? Yeah, I think training makes a lot of sense. We have a capability on ISR. Makes a lot of sense. But the core combat troops that are going to do the job to clean up, to crit, should be the Iraqi army. So I do believe we have a role. I don't believe we can walk away from the last decade, but it should be measured. And I think the President has taken absolutely the right approach. And the first question is, what is the governance model? And what are you going to do to protect the citizens of your country? With that, I think we can do a lot.
Let me just add one thing, and that is that to underline what you're saying about the governance model is what matters. I mean, you want to beat up on Maliki. I mean, I will too. I mean, that was just one of many disasters. But let's remember what preceded that. It was the American consul there, Jerry Bremer, who broke it up and got rid of all the trained military and all the trained bureaucracy and sent them home. And so it didn't start with Maliki, it started with us when Jerry Bremer, dismantled all of the ability of Iraq to govern itself.
Mickey, I would agree that we've made some mistakes. The invasion of Iraq was a mistake. It did not start with us. I was looking at the crowds in January of 2011, looking at the crowds at Tahrir Square and trying to understand what was going on. And what I noticed is there were no American flags being burned. There were no British flags being burned. A lot of British flags been burned over the decades. There were no Israeli flags being burned. And after thinking about this for several weeks, I realized it was the first time in 700 years it was not about somebody else. They were talking about their own problems. And you go back to Baghdad in the 13th century, it was the Bayat al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom, the center of knowledge. And then the Mongols came in and leveled it. They were there about 300 years. The Ottomans came in there about 300 years. And the British and the French drew lines after World War I. We can blame all this on the British and the French. But, we have straight lines between Colorado and Kansas, and nobody's shooting each other.
What can we do about that?
So, what you see in the Arab Spring has not gone away, and the ubiquitousness of information is bringing information to people that they've never had before. And aside from the extremist model, you have whole populations that are saying, we have underperformed. We want to compete. So it really is about their problems. There's jobs and housing and corruption and all of those things going on inside their own government. So I agree that we have made mistakes, but I really disagree with the argument that everything that's going on in the region is because of the United States.
I'd like to ask the panel myself a question. It seems like the question is, why are we in the middle of a Sunni Shiite battle? Ancient battle. And Muslims are actually now killing each other, which is different from Al-Qaeda. ISIS is killing Muslims. And I agree with you, okay, we attacked Iraq, so we have a responsibility. We can't just pull out. But what do you all on the panel think about why the rest of the Muslim world is not completely in an uproar about the fact that ISIS is killing Muslims? And shouldn't we be uniting with all of the Muslim world in a much more active way than we are? We are, I agree, the Sunni coalition is a great start, but shouldn't we be in the way that Obama is working on a coalition that's dealing with Iran? Shouldn't we be doing that much, much, much more in the region?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, building that coalition is important. I mean, I agree with that assessment, and I agree with what Jim said. We didn't do it all ourselves. There was stuff going on there. We did pour fuel on that fire. We poured fuel on the fire, but I certainly agree with Jim. We weren't the only big, turmoil there in the Middle East. Stuff was brewing. But in answer to your question, I have the feeling, I don't have the knowledge, but I have the feeling that to some extent they're sitting back because they're waiting for us to do it. If they can preserve their kingdom by having Americans be killed instead of their own people, hey, that's a good deal. And spending our money instead of their money, I don't know if that's the cause, but I'll bet that's part of it.
I'd like to ask Jim this, because you're really the expert. Some people have said that ISIS is Saudi Arabia's answer to Iran. That part of what's going on here is they've been funding these Sunni-based militants to go against the Iranian-backed regimes in Syria and Iraq, and that they're fighting a proxy war here. And one of the reasons you're not seeing Saudi Arabia and the rest of these Sunni Arab states rise up is because there's at least a part of the governments that want this to happen. Maybe they think they can control it. Maybe it's just a pushback. But this is beyond my. I'm genuinely asking the question if you think there's this proxy element going on here.
Well, there certainly is a Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's really based on a governance model as opposed to Sunni versus Shia. And Iran's part in that is to foment sectarian conflict as a method of destabilizing the region. Saudi Arabia is the other extreme. You know, they want modernization without change, nothing to change. So this is the dynamic at work. The question, the first part of your question is really important. And I would argue that in Daesh, you've got the unintended consequence of both a Saudi investment, which we supported, and, or at least for the first 15, 20 years.
Investment
in what we would call Wahhabism.
Oh, yes, yes.
And then Iran's, the unintended consequences of their regional foreign policy. Now, let me hit the first one. Wahhabism, as we know it, is really quietist Salafism. At its core, it's intolerant, conservative, and unyielding to any other view except that conservative view in terms of religion and culture. Politically, it is a voice of stability. And they quote the Quran and say, if you disagree with the ruler, you whisper in his ear. This is part of the pact between the first Al Saud and the Wahhabis that goes back to 1742. So after Nasser and the United Arab Republic, Arab nationalism, the counter over in the Gulf was have more of an Islamic identity. This was King Faisal in the early 70s. And then you get the takeover of the Holy Mosque in Mecca by Juhayman and the rise of Khomeini at the same time. And that's when the Saudis started to export their brand of Islam with oil money as a counterweight to Islamic revolutionary movement. The problem is it's easier to export intolerance than it is to export political stability. So what they were funding in their mind was conservative Islam, don't revolt,
yes,
that then morphed into conservative Islam, revolt against existing powers. So what you do have is the unintended consequence of the Saudi investment. The Iranians, on the other hand, have focused on a strategy of destabilization, and the child of that is Daesh, who is moving to cut the head off of every Shia they come in contact with, which is not exactly what they were looking for.
Right.
So at some point, there needs to be a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran to come to terms with this.
Is that possible?
They are starting to talk. And you're seeing the political leadership start to stand up because the religious community, the ulama, is incapable of doing it. So you are seeing some movement in that direction. And depending how the P5+1 talks settle, and when what happens in the 6 months to a year after that, in my view, is much more important than what has happened in the 6 months leading up to an agreement.
Okay.
So at this point, I'd love to see if we could ask the audience to talk to our panel and vice versa as well. And so I invite people to come up to the microphones, and especially students who we would love to have priority, and address your question either to a particular member of the panel or happily just to the panel in general.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sean O'Reilly, and I'm a student here at CU to get my certificate in Peace and Conflict Studies. And my question kind of plays off what Joanne and Mickey were saying, is that, and I'm going to play devil's advocate, I'm not saying that I agree with this, but I just having the opportunity to ask you guys, could we possibly be looking at this as an opportunity? I think because ISIL or Daesh is so extreme in their views, and as you were saying before, there's such a threat to mainly Muslim communities, could we look at this as an opportunity to bring or unite a lot of the Muslim world that have in the past been at each other's throats? I mean, you have Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia that are now coming to the table and actually having to talk to each other in terms of dealing with this threat. And as a second aspect of that, I feel like, is it also possible that ISIL is helping bring a lot of terrorist organizations that were hiding within civilian populations now have kind of a banner to rally under, and it's sort of bringing them out from the woodwork into the open where they're more vulnerable, for a lack of better terms? What are your thoughts on that perspective?
I can't answer. Great question, actually. But I think I'd like to hear from the ambassador. If you want to mention, say it. Well, or me.
Well, yes, it clearly could. You know, you never know when something like this happens, you know, where it's going to lead. But it could have that effect. But I don't know if that effect is worth having Americans die for. Mm-hmm. That's my concern. It's not that there can't be anything good. I mean, something good. You know, if you get the Iranians and the Saudis finding some way to talk about, can we have some accommodation? You know, that's great. And could it have other beneficial effects? Great. But that doesn't mean we send Americans over to get killed to do it.
Can I just get real short on this?
Yeah.
I think you can see the effect of the Daesh. I'm going to try using because I do prefer that word. I think it's better. The Daesh incompetence and extremism in the areas they've now conquered. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are now trying to rule these areas, and they are putting up governments. I mean, there is a Daesh Consumer Protection Agency. I'm not kidding. They haven't. But they're not having very much success. They're having lots and lots of problems. They've just lost some of their oil revenue with the reconquest of Tikrit. So you may see the citizens who thought this was going to be the nirvana that they promised in the propaganda revolt, weaken them. And I think that will happen, and I think that's one of the reasons I believe we'll be able to roll them back. But you're going to be able to bring the Arab, Persian, Shia, Sunni, Muslim world together, not for decades, not for a very long time. There are a lot of differences in this region, and we're going through, I think, an extended period of some disorder and working out of these differences. Some of it will be violent, some of it will be political, but it's not going to be solved anytime soon.
But one response, one really interesting reaction, Al Qaeda found ISIS too violent. Mm-hmm. They wanted them out, right? And now you're right. We're seeing Turkey, we're seeing Saudi Arabia, we're seeing some of the Sunni leaders stepping up and saying, wait, this is too violent. We don't want part of it. We want to stop it. So that's a good sign. Mm-hmm. Question is, it's a long battle.
I think you need to write an article for the New York Times.
Thank you. Will you co-author it with me?
Because at the end of the day, we tend to all want to default to arguing about a military solution. And what you've captured in your question is this idea, what is the place for dialogue? And how do you start that? Well, there have been some starting points. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia established a religious dialogue center in Vienna that really hasn't taken off yet. You see that, like, the center of spirituality is going back to Rome with the Pope that, is making the world more spiritual. So maybe it is time for us to stop and say there is a role for dialogue across ideas, regions, and not just religion. And if you could find a way to move that forward, you'd be doing a much greater service than those of us that are debating the ideas of whether or not we send soldiers.
Thank you very much.
Write the article.
And probably I'll ask that was a great question and loved the answers, but because we have so many questions, I think we'll have short answers. Thank you.
One of the proposed solutions to the problems dealing with ISIS involve the United States assisting in the training of forces that are in the local area. And I'm wondering what each of the panelists individually thinks about that, given the track record of the United States supporting militants who later go on to fight the United States and kill other Americans.
I think some limited training is prudent and could be effective.
I agree.
All right.
In the wake of the al-Shabaab attack, some people are arguing that al-Shabaab has the capacity to do these medium budget, high death toll operations because they gained control of territory, and since they lost the territory, they've had the resources to carry out these terrorist attacks. How can we handle the financial and personnel resources that these terrorist groups have gained through controlling territory once we take that territory away, especially in the case of ISIS and Boko Haram that have really achieved success in controlling territory recently?
One thing about al-Shabaab is Kenya attacked back recently, this week, which is a really good sign. You know, they're going to stop this before it takes over their country.
And you just saw the president of Nigeria lose an election, in part because in the 2 weeks before the election, he started doing military operations against Boko Haram, which were very successful. And he thought this was going to show the people that he was delivering. Instead, what they decided was, where the hell have you been? Exactly. Why didn't you do this earlier? And they elected the opponent overwhelmingly. So I think these groups are not as strong as they appear at first blush, and it is possible for states to conduct military operations that can roll them back, take back the territory, and run them as well as they did before. But once more, one of the problems we have is that all the governments we're talking about are incredibly corrupt and incompetent. And there's a reason that people are revolting against them. So having the government take back the territory isn't necessarily a fix.
I was just wondering what the rest of the panel thought about the Daesh actually being Islamic. The ambassador already expressed his opinion on the matter. However, in light of French journalists being released in 2014 of last year stating that they weren't actually using the Quran, they were just kind of preaching a lot towards them. They didn't even give them Qurans in the ISIS area. And I think it's an important point to define whether or not the Islamic State is actually Islamic, because I would argue that terrorists are a completely different animal.
I think that's a really good question, and it's a difficult question. I just had a dialogue in the United States with American Muslims and non-Muslims, and that was their point. This is not Islam. This is not what Islam teaches. But these are American Muslims, and in a way, I haven't heard people in the region standing up and saying that in a loud enough voice. I'd like to hear people in the region saying this is not Islam, this is violence, this is not what we stand for, but I don't hear it.
Yeah, it's just too hard, for me as a non-Muslim to know. I mean, it's like, do the Catholics, the Presbyterians, or the Southern Baptists have it right? I don't know any way to know.
I think it's the Roman Catholics, I think.
Maybe.
And I mean, the question just kind of is
I would argue we may be talking past each other just a little bit, okay? Because in no way is this the tenets of Islam of anybody that I've dealt with. But Islam is a decentralized religion. So if you can claim to have religious education and you have a following, you are an imam. And Daesh has 30,000 people as a part of their following. So until they are discredited, then they have to be considered Islam. The question is, who is going to discredit them?
Why don't the imams do that?
We don't have all day.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Mutadar Al-Zair. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I heard what Jim said about them using Islam to attract people, but then we've had a lot of reporters who say that they don't use Islam as a basis. And as a Muslim myself, I don't see them using the Quran in any way. Even though they have their flag says La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, it's nothing that they're not using Quran in any way or Islam in any way. And then I just want to remind the panel that the U.S. or in my I believe that the U.S. went into Iraq as using their ideology to remove someone who was Saddam Hussein, who was oppressing all the Shia, who were a majority in that area. So we can't really say that going in there was really a mistake. It was the U.S. went in there to remove an oppressor, remove someone who was not giving the people their democracy that they wanted or needed. And then Jim said that Iran was really advocating the people who are removing, like Jim said that Iran was causing unsettlement in the area, but Iran was helping the government who was democratically elected by the people who were the majority voted for, and then we see Saudi Arabia, who I know helped ISIS to become who they are today. The royal family helped ISIS, gave them money, gave them weapons, and so that's really something that the U.S. should look at as removing it using their ideology instead of seeing that there are interests in Saudi Arabia, so we're not going to do anything about it. So this time they should use their ideology and remove what Saudi Arabia did in that region.
Yeah. Is there anyone?
Do you want to comment on how the U.S. should use their ideology against Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni countries instead of just looking at ISIS as, or Iran as causing that mistrust, or in that area, the terrorism in that area?
Well, the only point I would disagree is in my time there, I could find no evidence that the government of Saudi Arabia supported ISIS. There is evidence that the Saudi government supported the Sunni tribal chiefs in Al-Anbar and continue. And that may have drifted into ISIS as they came back from Syria. But as far as direct support for ISIS, I can find no evidence of that. I think you're going to find...
Can I comment on that? It's just that some of the head muftis in that area were trying to tell the people to go and help these insurgencies in that area, and then when they arrived in Iraq and Syria, they were with ISIS, so they didn't know that they were going to ISIS. They were just told, go and fight for Islam in that area.
Well, you've got a different recruiting pattern for Daesh than you did for either Iraq in 2004 or the recruiting into Afghanistan in the late 80s. Because for Afghanistan and into Iraq in 2004, the recruiting poster was to go to recruit jihadists to come fight for Islam. The recruiting campaign for Daesh in Syria had nothing to do with that. It was all about come help fight against an oppressive ruler that's killing fellow Muslims. And then the indoctrination started after they got there. So the recruiting pool was much different, even in the early days, back in 2011, 2012.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you all for coming. So even though it's in the title, I was wondering if you guys could talk a little more about Boko Haram, particularly with attention to the girls that were kidnapped last year, the recent election, and this wider context of radical Islamic terror. And this is for whoever wants to take it.
I'm sorry, I just don't know much about the group. That's why I hardly mention them.
Sure.
Well, Boko Haram is on the run. There's no question about that. But you have an incompetent government in place that was playing politics, and I think I forget Joe was captured that correctly. But they do now have a coalition of countries, including their neighbor Chad, and they're rolling back Boko Haram. So they're losing territory. the problem is nobody's quite put a finger on where these girls are. And the difficulty there is that as they've been leaving villages, they've been killing the young women who have been directed to be wives of Boko Haram fighters so that will never marry anybody else. So there's going to be more tragedy even as Boko Haram gets rolled up. I think if you look at all of those different entities, Boko Haram is probably on the run more than either Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula. Al-Qaeda mothership is in trouble, but you've got al-Nusra and Daesh are the two big ones.
And I think, they recently said they were part of ISIS, but I think it was out of weakness that they wanted to look. I don't know. I don't know much about it either, but it's an horrendous situation with the girls that have been kidnapped.
Yes, sir.
All right, so the USA has supported many oppressors in the past. Like an example, in Iran, the CIA enforced a coup against the elected prime minister, then supported the king and his secret police, resulting in the hostage crisis. So my question is, how can we learn from our past mistakes, and what can we do to make sure we don't make the same mistakes?
So, a very simple question, I think.
Well, we obviously don't do it very well. Part of it is the executive branch, does a lot of this stuff, but it's up to, the people control the Congress, and it's up to the Congress to stand up and when there is a policy being put in place that is not in the best interest of the country, it's up to the Congress to say no. The president's not in charge of foreign policy, no matter how often he says it. It is, in the Constitution, there is ample opportunity for the Congress to step in and say, that is a bad path to be going down. We've done it before. You've got people in Congress who've been there a long time, and you have, institutional memory there, and there's still, there's some of us who remember when those things happened, when the coup in Iran. So I don't know any other way. We have, you said it, Joe. We have very short memories, and that's maybe if our universities did a better job of teaching history or whatever, it might work, but I don't want to suggest that.
Well, I would suggest that you elect people, first of all, that know something about the world.
Yeah.
It would be helpful, right?
That's a good idea.
And secondly, every single person in this room, all of us have a huge obligation to learn more. I mean, we're up in this panel trying to answer questions to things that are very complicated and hard to figure out. But we all don't know a lot about these parts of the world, and everybody needs to go out and meet people, invite them for dinner, have phone calls, have town hall meetings with people from these countries, talk to people. We need to understand so much more. And we have Congress trying to make decisions without having been to any of these countries practically. So,
thank you.
One quick thing. You're part of the solution. I mean, one of the ways we learn from our mistakes is to learn about our mistakes. And you're here in a university. Half the audience is in this university. This is your chance, man. Yeah. This is your chance. And I know it's tough because you are cursed with living in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It is tough to stay inside.
Get out and see the world.
To stay in snow. But this is it. My son teaches history in high school, and I looked at his textbook on Iran. It was good. It was good. I mean, they talked about the 53 coup against Mossadegh. So it's there. It's in the books. You just got to take a few hours every week and learn about this, because I'm telling you, if you don't learn about it, 20 years from now, we're going to be involved in another stupid war about a place we don't know anything about, and you go, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Good.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm an international affairs student here at CU, and I'm from Argentina. I'm an international affairs student here at CU, and I'm from Argentina. So I grew up with the idea of, one, the U.S. having a huge influence in the world, always, whatever it does. And me growing up with almost no military like influence army. Like that was not something that didn't happen in my country. So every time I think about war, I think about how war always happens and it keeps on happening, and like dialogue doesn't happen, and how it's hard, like, and actually what you said about we need to elect people that know about the country. I was thinking about how Jim explained the history and like the background behind the conflict, and then how Joe was talking about dividing the culture in half, kind of. And I was thinking because the U.S. has so much influence over the world, why does it always have to rely on war? And why doesn't it have people that actually work like in the military but know more about the underlying, like the background, the why of the conflict? And isn't there a way of like resolving it? Obviously, military is needed. Like it's part of how the world works. But thinking about like the after, like why don't we think about why this conflict happened in the first place, or where it started, and the U.S. influencing the world in a more cultural or like historic, dialogue way, like to think, for what to do after the war. Because I feel that it's always about the war and stopping ISIS and then what?
I'm in the State Department. I mean, I think there are people who do understand the world, and they are trying. And there was actually a plan that was proposed by the State Department for what to do after Iraq, but it was ignored. It was ignored.
And why isn't that part showed in the press too? Because I feel that everything that we hear and we listen to is the war, and if we are sending more, like if the U.S. is sending army, and if it's not, and the behind the scenes part where people work and actually know, and like I was impressed at what Jim told about the history, and I was like, and why is that explained in the newspapers, and like people knowing that there's actually something behind that happening too, and it's not only sending troops.
I would say you have a big job here. I mean, you've got to tell your fellow students about Argentina, about Latin America, and because who knows what future issues we'll have with Argentina, and people don't know anything.
Let me just say a quick word, because we have to close up soon, about the U.S. military. I don't think any of the problems we've described here were the result of the U.S. military. The leaders that I've met in our military are some of the best educated, smartest, most worldly people I've ever met. The U.S. military had great skepticism about going into Iraq. They weren't pushing this. The military leaders got demoted for expressing concern about the war plan that the Secretary of Defense was pushing. In my view, it's the U.S. military isn't our problem. It's some of the political leaders that we've elected that are part of the problem.
I would just also... I would agree with that. Just very quickly, I think we also... we have tools, soft power tools, foreign aid and all that we could use much more effectively, but we underfund them. We need to be spending more on foreign aid, not less. We need to be spending more on diplomacy. We need to be spending more on Voice of America types of things. There are ways that we can influence the world, without using guns. But American people, maybe not the people in this room, but protest about the money we spend on foreign aid. That's better than the guns in trying to, make the world the way we want it.
In the aftermath of World War I, William Butler Yeats wrote a poem called The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Thank you very much.
And I'm afraid on that optimistic note that we will need to conclude. I apologize to all of you who wanted to ask questions. I would just quickly like for us all to have a round of applause for Jim, Joanne, Mickey, and Joe. Thank you.
were great. You were great. I meant it. You should have ended the panel right there. This is
Jim, this
an
was
appendix.
great. Thank you. Really enjoyed this.
Hi.